2, terminology. Negotiate terminology before you negotiate ideology. Let me do a quick test with you. If your camera is on, I want you to show your hands on camera. If not, raise your hand in the chat. Leading up to 20, I'm going to ask you a question, and if you agree, raise your hand. You don't have to raise it yet. It's only if you agree with what I say. Up until 2003, Israel was experiencing a massive incline in terrorist attacks until it became so unbearable that in 2003, Israel had to erect a separation wall to avoid Palestinians who wanted to be suicide bombers to penetrate Israel. By a show of hands, who support Israel's right to having a separation wall? Just raise your hand. Okay, great. Lower your hand and let me ask you the question again. Leading up to the 2003 year where we had a massive increase in terrorist attacks in Israel, Israel ultimately had to defend itself and as a result decided to erect an apartheid wall. Raise your hand if you agree with Israel's right to raise an apartheid wall. Anna, I saw you raise and then lower. Elad, Judy, you're not raising your hand. I thought you raised it before. Why aren't you raising your hand?
Because of the terminology.
Oh,
it's not apartheid.
Oh, it's not. You guess what? It's also not a wall, and it's also not a separation wall. It's a security fence. 95% of that barrier is actually fence, and 5% is a wall, and only in places where a fence wouldn't do. And so we really need to pay attention to the language that is being used, because if we go back to system 1, system 2, we go back to the experiential memory versus the cognitive memory, language, terminology, specific phrases can be so emotionally and historically loaded that if we don't pay attention to the words we're using, even if the arguments we provide later about why it's okay to have the barrier, they're not going to help because people have already associated the situation with something that they have an historical knowledge about. Why did the Palestinians push the apartheid wall? Because everybody still remembers apartheid South Africa. So if Israel is associated with apartheid South Africa, it must be bad. Just like hostages, the people who took them must be bad, right? The brain is lazy, very, very lazy. The brain wants to reach conclusions as quickly as it can. I saw a black cat, I walked into a wall, black cats must be unlucky. We try to make sense of the world in the shortest possible path. And so language is very, very powerful and for years has been used against us. Genocide, freedom fighters, apartheid wall, innocent civilians, roadblocks, occupied territories, collective punishment. What I want to show you is the alternative terminology that you can negotiate into the conversation. Now, you don't have to stop the person and say, hey, why'd you say apartheid wall? You don't have to do that. If they use the term collective punishment, you can say, I understand your concern about what's happening in Gaza, and it really is very, very sad. Unfortunately, Israel must take defensive measures in order to protect itself, and it must do everything it can to free the hostages. Meaning, what I do is I'm covertly negotiating the terminology. If I'm speaking to somebody in front of an audience, I might call them out on the use of the word genocide. I might ask them questions that speak to the fact of, how many Palestinians were there 60 years ago living in that territory? How many today? The growth is exponential. How does that sit with genocide? What are I could do that if I wanted, if I really wanted to affect the entire audience. But really what I want you to understand is that when you're speaking with somebody, the first thing you need to care about is, what do they think about you? The second thing you need to care about is, what language are they using? And only after you gather this knowledge, you can build a strategy in terms of how to relate to them, and you can prioritize. I'm going to use empathy, and I'm going to pay attention to the terminology, and anytime they use apartheid wall, I will use a different term called the security fence. And when they call it occupied territories, I might call it disputed territories. And I'm going to try to create a ratio of 1 to 3, 1 to 4, right? So for every one time that Judy or Sam use innocent civilians, I will use human shields. Now, I'm not suggesting they're not innocent civilians. I don't know. Some of them support Hamas, some of them don't. A baby is probably universally innocent. But I do know that they're not just innocent civilians, they're also human shields And remember the secondary narrative I spoke about before, Hamas is the root cause, bringing the conversation back to the idea of what does it mean to manage a war where the other side is using its own population to shield itself is a conversation worth having. And that narrative is spreading around the world right now like never before. I've never seen this issue of human shields being discussed by so many news networks and leaders as I am today.